By this point, you probably already know what an on-demand service is. The subscription models where you pay 10 to 20 bucks a month to get instant access to a bunch of video games that you probably already own. And I've seen a lot of back and forth over whether this is even worth getting into or not. After all, paying the price of 2 new games a year to get instant access to the big new game that comes out, along with the ability to play online as well, sounds like one pretty good deal. There is a debate over whether or not a model like this is even profitable, which, if you consider it under the scope that if one person buys the subscription and a new game is in the subscription, the company is losing 45 bucks a sale, adding up to millions of lost revenue. But such a scenario can't really be proven yet definitively, since people are still buying games individually. They tend to bloat the service with games that come out years ago, and most of these games are games as a service anyway, so they can just put a little battle pass in it or something and make that money back tenfold by just making their game 15 bucks, or even just free. But one thing I found interesting is that this kind of service isn't some radical new idea that Microsoft just pulled out of their ass one day in 2017. This kind of model has been around for decades now, and in an attempt to try to find some of the earlier versions of what we have now, I found a really interesting service Sega deployed in 1994 called SEGA Channel that did a slightly different version that used cable providers to sell people a dedicated channel entirely to give buyers the ability to play a catalog of games and even get the opportunity to play games that haven't come out as early demos. I think what made this service so special is that it just could not exist today. It's just so cool to see how they got this working in a time period where the internet only just started a decade earlier with the conception of the TCP/IP model that gave computers a universal way to communicate with one another. Again, at the time, PC gaming still kinda sucked ass, let alone cost a fortune back then, so it wasn't exactly a household commodity yet, but there was something people definitely had in the mid-90s, and that was cable television. So one fine morning, some goobers from Sega reached out to TCI and Time Warner Cable and proposed a service that uses their companies to provide an on-demand gaming subscription, and it allowed people to download a game and play it as long as they like until the console is shut down. But wait, this was an online service that didn't really use the internet we have today. How does it work then? Well, to start, if you wanted to opt in for SEGA Channel, you had to purchase an activation fee of around $20 just so you can get an adapter, and you could just insert it into your Sega Genesis or even the 32X adapter if you felt like it. It didn't work on the Sega CD though, but that's also kind of a no dice when you consider that CDs can contain significantly more data than cart-ROM can handle. But anyway, the adapter would pick up the data from your service provider, and then the signal that is sent to you would be picked up by the device, which understands what it is and converts it back into program code that you can play. There are modded ROMs of SEGA Channel that allows you to at least see what the service looked like, since you can't really use the service anymore. Most of what seems to be backed up was from a user called Billy Time Games, who has painstakingly recovered every known iteration of SEGA Channel by month under this project called SEGA Channel Revival. Now that said, this isn't a regular ROM that any emulator can just plug and play. The poster recommends using a custom core that allows you to play it. The core on Windows uses a DLL file extension, and you only just need to put the file in your core folder and it will immediately recognize it. On RetroArch, once you have the core loaded, you can then go to load content and locate the ROMs that you have gotten into the archive.org site mentioned earlier, which looks to be in a markdown file extension. The recommended solution right now is to download the custom core included in the archive.org site, which includes versions that include cores built for Android, RetroPie, Windows, and Linux. And after loading that into your RetroArch, you can then load up your core with the file you just input, and then you can load up your ROM and you now have access to SEGA Channel. The game boots up with the title screen of Sonic bouncing on your Genesis, and the coaxial cable starts loading stuff into your SEGA Channel cart, as the mascot Sega Pat comes to life, followed by the logo reveal. Obviously the service stopped 20 plus years ago, so if you had tried to do this on native hardware, it would give you the error screen saying that it can't find the service. But we get booted to a series of catalogs that vaguely represent a genre of games or groups of games, like a group for games that you would play in front of the family, for example. The first catalog is always the time demo section, which lets the player have the ability to play a new game for a bit. The time is usually determined by the type of game, and the system will let you know how long you can play as you are downloading it on the original hardware. There also is a section at the top to let the user know the various information about the game, like the ESRB rating, the controls for a game, some cheat codes, and even a catalog of phone numbers you can call if you're stuck in a game. There even was a PO box for you to send out any mail to SEGA Channel's operations, which requested feedback or even fan art if you wanted. And that's pretty much the entire service. And then I found the patents that were made for this device. There's 3 patents that make SEGA Channel work, but I want to focus on patent 568.54746, which explains the process that is done to get the games from the service provider all the way to the subscriber. I guess this is also a good opportunity to practice my After Effects, so... So, it all starts with the subscriber database contained within the national service provider, which is SEGA, which informs the service who subscribe to SEGA Channel, and that tells the game server where to send that signal throughout the country. While that is happening, a separate database contains the National Game Archive, which is what is sent to the subscribers, but appears to be updated via a CD-ROM and encrypted by the game server prior to transmission so that the data isn't just getting hijacked by non-subscribers or bad actors trying to get subscriber information. The game server manages all this data from the game archive, the subscriber authorization computer, and the CD-ROM that updates anything within it. Finally, the game server transmits to a satellite service provider and transmits the games and any subscriber data to that provider so that the next in line will know that there is an update to the service and who opted into the service. To keep this high level, I want to skim over the satellite section since it also talks about different ways this data is transmitted outside of just satellite, and move on to the local service provider who receives the satellite signals and needs to find a way to decrypt the data that was just sent to them. So how is this done? The process is completed via decryption by demodulation. So what the hell does that even mean? To explain the best way I can without butchering this definition, modulation is the technique of altering the characteristics of a carrier signal with methods like amplitude, frequency, or the phase so that the information you transmit is encoded. Demodulation is the reverse of that process back into the original transmission. Each modulation process is somewhat different, which the one used by SEGA Channel is a QPSK modulator, and then it's demodulated from a QPSK receiver. The patent offers other methods to transmit this data other than via satellite, and one is just mailing disks to the local service provider, and then they had to use their own disk drives to get that data to the subscribers. But anyway, the data is then sent to a subscriber location via another round of modulation and demodulation between the local provider and the subscriber, and then it's available to be received via a twisted pair cable for telephones, coaxial, or fiber optic, but the one that he chose was coaxial. There's 2 other patents as well, but they aren't really as interesting, so I'll probably cover them in another video if I really feel like getting into detail about it. So now that we know how the system works, how did it actually do? Well, the service started in 1994 and ended 4 years later in 1998, which for an appliance so late into the Genesis lifetime, is actually kind of surprising that it even lasted so long. According to an IGN article I just ripped straight out of the Wikipedia page for SEGA Channel, the service received around 250,000 subscribers, which for a service that costs $15 a month, we can say the revenue was around $3.75 million a month. That means that if the service stayed with that amount within just 1 year in 1994, they could make $45 million, which adjusting for inflation makes that amount actually more around 93. Of course that didn't happen because if you look in hindsight, this kind of service in the long run kind of sucked ass, for mainly 3 reasons. The first is that cable transmissions at that time had a really bad tendency to fail to transmit the signal because cable providers used analog television to broadcast their channels, which leads to a lot of interference, which is fine for TVs, but you can't really afford to have a degradation of your signal when you're transmitting code over analog, so noise would make it practically impossible to transmit to the end user, and end users that can't get what they paid for are people who unsubscribe. Luckily, there was this little thing coming up called digital television, which doesn't have the problems that analog does. It's just that it's not really going to be a thing until around 1998, when the United States and other various countries start transitioning to that new format. And it didn't even replace analog until a 2009 mandate, which was originally supposed to be in 2006 as part of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. It's really funny how this device was just too early to take advantage of the technology of the next millennia, but too late for it to be worth using as an alternative to video game rental stores, which also slowly phased out after 2000 once people realized that they can use this internet thing to sell goods and services over the mail instead of this. Which is actually the second problem with SEGA Channel. It was released in 1994. If you don't know why that's a problem, the original Sega Genesis released in 1989, so this service came out 5 years in the console's lifetime. And the Sega Saturn was just going to come out a year later for Americans, so what this thing is advertising is a service to rent out a catalog of video games that, more likely than not, you already owned or rented anyway at a considerably beyond the peak of the console's cultural relevance. Sure, there was the early access feature that allowed you to play a new game beforehand, but given that there was already another console and this service wouldn't work on the shiny new thing people want, what was the point? And there was probably the last big problem that was with the service, in that it was really fucking expensive. Remember when I said that the service was only $15 a month? That was because it was in 1994 money. If you bought something in 1994 today for $15, the same thing would set you back $31 every month and $372 a year for just a service that gives you at most something 50 games on a dead console. Imagine that sales pitch today if someone tried to sell you a service that was half the price of a regular video game, that mainly sold you games that you probably already own, and maybe some new games every once in a while, along with the ability to just use the internet you already paid for. That simple extra $15 probably would have killed a service like that nowadays. I mean, can you even imagine needing to pay $30 a month on a service that progressively over the years gets less and less worth in value? At the end of the service's lifetime, a bunch of SEGA Channel subscribers were told to return their carts back to their original service provider since, you couldn't use the service anymore. Some people just decided to not do that, and because of that, there's a decent amount of adapters that are still in circulation. They aren't uber expensive or anything, probably because you don't want to pay a retro tax for a thing that doesn't fucking work anymore, but it's also not cheap either, because there's a finite amount you can find. At most, I found a couple adapters for $100, but it's not like they're going to be sold anytime soon, because why the hell would you unironically buy this? It just goes to show how ridiculous the retro market has become over the years. Like, have you ever tried to buy a DS Pokemon game at a retro store in the past couple of years? You'd think that a game that sold millions of copies wouldn't be setting you back $200 fucking dollars. In my honest opinion, if you want to get into retro collecting, just don't. It's gotten way too expensive to get into, and most of the older shit is reaching that point where the plastic that holds those games are starting to decompose, and eventually you're just not going to have a game anymore. A lot of the stuff made in the 80s or 90s wasn't exactly putting top priority on preserving the media, and that only gets worse when you're talking about internet-dependent games such as games as a service. The moment a provider decides they don't want to work on a game anymore, that game or service essentially is gone forever until someone can build a workaround that allows people to play it again. The hundreds of dollars of money I can spend on Counter-Strike could literally mean nothing once I'm done playing my game or lose my account, or even if the service turns off. Hell, we could very well see that happen to Team Fortress 2 in a couple years, and the cult of Operation Mecha Engineer will have to find another community to kill off from vapid gatekeeping. Emulation or re-releases are kind of the best option you get for long-term preservation of these older games, but some people just don't seem to realize that it's really fucking hard to do that. Sure, the emulators that we have now blow any efforts most multi-billion-dollar companies have tried out of the water, but it took 30 plus years for SNES and N64 emulation to get where it is now. PS3 emulation only now is able to play every game in its library after a decade of development, and we only just now got to PS4 being able to emulate its entire PS exclusive library. As opposed to the meat grinder of AAA development, emulator developers have all the time in the world to work on this and beyond, and add that with the fact that a lot of these emulators are open source and can allow people to do things more than just play the games, but improve them, edit them, or even break them.
Was I dreaming?
How do you feel?
Oh, like I've been run over by a truck.
I guess the moral of this story then is that you can't really rely on companies keeping the shit you buy forever, so it's probably always going to be up to the volunteers that dedicate their years to protect the media that people love so that we can play them forever in the best looking form. If it wasn't for some dude in archive.org, I wouldn't be able to show you what this service looked like, so be glad that there are people out there that care enough to revive a service that nobody uses anymore just for the sole purpose of showing people what it was like if they were ever curious.
Get out of here!